Bilski, Minerva Center, and Rachel, and also Edith for this kind invitation and organizing this fantastic conference. And I apologize for not being able to be here because I was dealing with renewal of my visa here. So sorry for missing the first day of this wonderful conference. So today I would like to talk about actually the historical process, the context itself with respect to the confiscation, expropriation, and the legal plunder, so-called legal plunder of Armenian and Jewish properties within the framework of, or under the veil of law, or legal procedures, let's say. But before getting into details of my presentation, I would like to make a few points regarding, yeah, I don't even need it anymore. So, we have mentioned or uttered even certain concepts such as restitution, compensation, reclaims of properties, or at least their equivalent values or so. In the context of Turkey, we are just, laying way and way behind all these processes because we are encountering a long-lasting denialist regime of the Armenian genocide or the mass destruction of Armenians. Let's say you don't have to even use the word genocide. So if you take it as a political, or value, loaded with political, concepts or political connotations. So denialism of Turkish state, which is funded by, orchestrated by the regime itself, actually, it's also referring the continuation of the genocidal regime in post-World War era, post-Ottoman era, and the Turkish Republic. And therefore, we lack of even the documentation of the liquidation, plunder, looting, and expropriation and confiscation of our main properties during the war and aftermath, and immediately aftermath of the war as well, World War I. So, because of the inaccessibility of the documents, inaccessibility of the archival materials and records which are located and situated in the Ottoman archives. So I spent almost 2 years and conducting research in the Prime Minister Ottoman archives in Istanbul to be able to write my dissertation on how the confiscation and the transfer of wealth process was carried out in a certain particular town, which was my hometown actually, Antep. It's situated southeastern part of Turkey, 55 miles away from Aleppo. And I haven't encountered one single document regarding this process, and I kept asking questions about the records of liquidation commission, which was established in the town in August 1915. And we know there were records, there were, notebooks, and also list of properties of the deported people from the town. But I always receive the following answer: no comment, or these documents have not been catalogued yet, which means these documents do exist, actually, physically speaking. So we are in this kind of situation, this post-genocidal regime, let's say. And also, my presentation is basically based on the economic destruction of the two particular certain communities. So the Jews, especially the Jews in Nazi Germany, and also the Armenians who were living in most of the Asia Minor, Anatolia, in Turkey. So economic destruction of a given community, when we think about the word genocide, which was coined by Raphael Lemkin, we always think about the physical, violent physical destruction aspect of it. So we neglect the economic destruction, cultural destruction as well. So that's why it's an indispensable and defining feature of the notion of genocide itself as well. So you cannot, you don't have to destruct a certain group of people or certain race or certain nation group by forcing or exerting physical force. So you can also make their existence non-existence by imposing even legal procedures and to confiscate their properties. So physical destruction and economic destruction or alteration of a given community always in the mass violence events especially goes hand in hand. It took place in the case of Rwanda, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and all other cases. So it's a general pattern what we are talking about here. And for the sake of comparative aspect, I will take two cases, Armenian genocide and the Jewish Holocaust, but also what the Tsarist Russia during the World War I applied to their non-alien, let's say, alien enemy citizens. So they basically established an ethnicity regime, and they applied liquidation and the confiscation laws to the properties of the non-Russian enemy aliens. like Poles, the Germans, who had Russian citizenship at the time, but who were not ethnically Russians. So when you look at these two cases, actually you will see number of convergences and similarities between the Ottoman case and the Russian case during the World War I. They're just a carbon copy of each other, let's say. So for the sake of this presentation, I will get into details of the Jewish case and the Armenian case. So expropriation of the wealth and the assets of Ottoman Armenians and the Jews under the Nazi regime were systematic, organized and deliberate process. By systematically distributing and auctioning of Armenian and Jewish possessions, both Union and Progress Party, who was the Ottoman ruling government at the time during the war, and the Republican regime, founded by the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and the Nazi regimes turned broad segments of the respective Muslim and German populations into accomplices in their policies of plunder and expansion, transforming them into material beneficiaries of the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust. To pilfer and expropriate Armenians and Jews and thus destroy their economic basis for survival was an essential component of the CUP, the Ottoman ruling government party, and the National Socialist policy. The application of the so-called legal and bureaucratic mechanisms is a defining feature of confiscation of Armenian and Jewish properties. Despite the existence of plunder, theft and spoliation, the bulk of the remaining Armenian and Jewish property was confiscated by a number of legal and bureaucratic means and methods under state orchestration. The intentional euphemism of abandoned property, administered and protected by the Turkish state, and a property falling to the right was intended to ensure bureaucrats and state officers of the legality of their deeds. The exhaustive process of administrating and selling the property of deported Armenians and Jews usually involved considerable administrative efforts, employing hundreds of local staff. In particular, the leaders of the CUP and the Nazi state sought to ensure that the lion's share of the wealth went to the benefit of the Turkish state and the Third Reich. This, of course, did not prevent widespread corruption and private gain. The main problem facing the authorities' administration of Armenian Jewish property in many places was corruption. It should be emphasized that the corruption was fairly rife among the bureaucrats and officers of the abandoned property commissions, liquidation commissions, who were responsible actors for administering and confiscating Armenian properties. Under the supervision and for the advantage of the state, similar problems existed during the appropriation of Jewish property as well. If Armenian genocide and the Holocaust are to be understood as a function of bureaucratic processes, this is particularly well illustrated by the perpetrators' exhaustive efforts to register all Armenian and Jewish property, along with the deportation and extermination of these two communities. Both the CUP and the Nazi regime relied to a considerable extent on the cooperation of the local and administration, institutions, and population. Large numbers of ordinary Muslims, as well as local elites and provincial notables, and the Germans became implicated in the purchase of Armenian and Jewish assets. With the expropriation of and sale of Armenian and Jewish properties, the CUP, later the Turkish Republic, and the Reich took the closed gaps in the state finances and financed the war efforts of the Ottoman Empire and the Nazi Germany. For the Armenians and Jews, deprivation of property considerably reduced their chances of survival. As in the case of Armenians, material destruction of the Jews had to be done, so-called legally, which explains both the distortion of existing laws to exploit them as well as incredible proliferation of laws, decrees, and regulations concerning them. The main purpose of Turkification and Aryanization was the dispossession of countless thousands of Armenians and Jews and their systematic removal from virtually every sector of the economy by transferring their movable and immovable properties and businesses to the Turkish and the Aryan hands. Confiscation by the state had the object of ensuring the CUP and the German Reich, not private individuals, became the prime beneficiary of Armenian and Jewish wealth. So Aryanization of Jewish wealth and assets was carried out through a number of measures utilized to systematically plunder Jewish assets, including the flight tax, special block accounts in marks for potential immigrants, and random manipulation of exchange rates. By bringing various particular taxes, measures of punishment and confiscation decrees into effect, the state administered the possession of German Jews. Similar to the expropriation process of Ottoman Armenians' property, legal procedures were used to provide the Nazi government and other beneficiaries with a legal guise. For instance, the Reich flight tax, which came into force in 1931, initially intent to block capital flight during the economic depression. So German Jews were not main target at the time. Its severe provisions entailed that 25% of all domestic wealth will be confiscated from the prospective immigrants. This tax soon became a rigid barrier preventing Jews from transferring their capital out of Germany, especially after widespread Jewish immigration began in 1933. Jews eventually became the largest group to immigrate from the country. Not only was the taxation deliberately manipulated to strip the Jews of their assets, but it also provided so-called legitimate cover for the allegation that Jews owe the state for staving off German taxes in the future. Similarly, the system of foreign exchange controls became another powerful tool for the Nazi regime to systematically plunder Jewish assets and prevent smuggling of the capital out by limiting the amounts of money Jews could take out of the country. Jews who plan to escape and liquidate their wealth often place their money in blocked accounts in order to ensure that numerous taxes and impositions will be paid. It's important to note that these taxes and impositions multiplied drastically after the Kristallnacht in November 1938, and this caused the total impoverishment and the wholesale expropriation of German Jews, and it enabled Hermann Göring to develop his extensive plans to banish all Jews from the economy in 1938. Eventually, the remaining Jewish assets were secured through the blocking of the bank accounts, and the Third Reich could seize those rights after the mass deportations, which began in October of 1941. As a post-Armenian case, after being stripped of their belongings, Jews were subsequently forced to immigrate. During the first months of the Nazi government, Nazification of all government departments was not fully completed, and so a considerable number of wealthy Jews were able to liquidate their assets and move abroad without suffering any serious losses. Therefore, there were quite a lot of well-to-do Jews among the first wave of emigres. On the other hand, Armenians were deprived of such means. They were not allowed to sell their properties and assets before or after the deportations. In short, unlike Jews in Germany, Armenians were not permitted to liquidate their wealth. Of course, this, in the case of Holocaust, this liquidation came to a halt to a certain time period. At the organization and agency level, the Finanzamt Moabit West, as the regular financial bureaucracy, was the main agency concerned with the expropriation of Jews under the Nazi regime. Finanzamt Moabit had similar tasks and objectives of the liquidation commission of the Ottoman case, and these entities function in a similar manner. The collection, administration, and exploitation of the assets and the possessions of deported Jews were the responsibility of the Reich Minister of Finance and the director of the tax office in Berlin, who assigned the fulfillment of these tasks to the directors of the regional tax offices. Jewish assets were appropriated through the cooperation of the financial bureaucracy and Gestapo, and after Jews had been dismissed from their jobs, forced to close down their businesses, and either driven into exile or deported to the east for forced labor, were most of them purged. The process is the following. Similar to the functions of the Abandoned Property and Liquidation Commission of the Union and Progress Party, in the Ottoman case, initially the main objective of the Gestapo was to secure properties, seal the vacant apartments, and leave the keys with the building's supervisor. Assigned to administer and sell the properties, the regional financial authority was also in charge of obtaining property declarations from the security police. These were prepared by Jewish owners prior to their departure. The liquidation commissions of the Union and Progress Party also follow parallel procedure. First, the financial administration set the suitable properties aside for itself. Then remaining movable properties were put on sale, auctions, locally to individuals, or in bulk to the Nazi welfare organization or cities damaged by bombs. Yeah. Despite the differences in terms of the office in charge, there were significant similarities between functions and missions of the Finanzamt Moabit West and those of the Liquidation Commission during the CUP period. So, in contrast to Ottoman Armenians, also Jews managed to cash their insurance policies and then use the money to pay their taxes and the cost of emigration, especially until 1939. I just want to emphasize this, I'm talking only in the case of Nazi Germany. At this point, there's a significant difference between Armenian and Jewish cases. Unlike Ottoman Armenians, German Jews at least had the chance to immigrate in 1938 and 1939. In order to immigrate, they had to pay huge amounts of money in taxes, and in order to pay these taxes, they had to dispose of a great part of their assets. Ottoman Armenians, however, were not allowed to emigrate at all. As opposed to Ottoman Armenians, German Jews also managed to sell their real estate and possessions, usually for below actual worth in the late 1930s, for the same taxation and immigration forces. So I would like to also talk about the denaturalization of these two cases as a main departure point, especially from the Armenian case. The law for revocation of naturalization and annulment of German citizenship, so published July 1933. So it was ultimately to become one of the main legal mechanisms exploited by the Third Reich for comprehensive confiscation of Jewish property by the state. So the revocation of naturalization and annulment of German citizenship law was initially used to eliminate opponents of the Nazi regime by removing their citizenship rights. Soon the process of denaturalization and property seizure of Jewish immigrants become linked to the expropriation. So this entire transaction was executed with a high degree of institutional continuity. And for instance, in October 1941, mass deportation of German Jews started. The moment Jews crossed the borders of the Reich, their citizenship rights were automatically annulled, and all their assets fell into the hands of the Nazi state. In contrast to that, there was no discussion of annulling Ottoman Armenian citizenship took place during the deportations and genocide. So, in the case of Holocaust, by annulling the citizenship of the German Jews, Nazi state immediately confiscated their property. So they introduced that kind of legal procedures. But in the case of Ottoman Armenians, the Ottoman ruling government maintained and preserved the citizenship of Ottoman Armenians in order to liquidate their properties. So, by taking advantage of legal mechanization, the CUP government and afterwards the governments of the Turkish Republic and the National Socialist government in Germany laid their hands of Armenian and Jewish properties. Throughout both dispossession processes, there were many similarities in terms of recording movable and immovable properties of Ottoman Armenians and German Jews through a series of legal mechanisms and the liquidation of their wealth by other bureaucratic institutions. Beginning with the CUP government and continued by the Turkish Republic, the confiscation process of all Armenian assets by manipulating the law was carried out. In the case of Holocaust, this process was accomplished through similar means. Jews within Nazi Germany and other Jews in various European countries invaded by Hitler's armies saw their wealth transferred to the treasury of the Third Reich. Jewish properties and wealth were appropriated within the limits of the law, which provided a legitimate guise for the Nazi leaders. Therefore, they were able to finance the war and distribute the proceeds among the central and local actors, who actively supported the regime and various societal sections that belonged to the Aryan race. By annulling their citizenship right, Germany reduced Jews' legal status to civilian death. In other words, legally, they were completely disregarded. In the case of Nazis, the so-called legitimacy provided by the veneer of legality was mostly at the bureaucratic level. That is to say, the Nazi state did not really care about the legality of the process. Right from the beginning, the Third Reich made its intentions clear. It was following the specific policies of liquidation and expropriation toward Jewish properties. This was never a secret. In the case of Ottoman Armenians, on the other hand, the CUP regime made a serious effort to hide under the guise of legality when carrying out the deed. For Nazis, the confiscation was merely a bureaucratic process. Legal and bureaucratic regulations introduced by the Nazis were explicitly directed at acquiring Jewish properties. Consequently, in Nazi laws, everything is laid bare without any hesitation. For Ottoman Armenians, however, the government resorted to numerous oblique means to conceal their intentions, which nonetheless are readily discernible when analyzed closely. Thank you so much for your patience.